consultant nutrition physician in our Ragama hospital. So today we hope to discuss a few of the principles and the applications of nutrition in our surgical practice. So students, remember, this is a very important topic, and most of the times it's a forgotten topic because nutrition is one of the things which we tend to care for in the least manner. So, but eventually it becomes a pillar of our practice. So I suggest that you open your ears and open your minds for this lecture and start practicing and pointing out in patients' management the good practices of nutrition. So over to you, Shalika.
Thank you, Dr. Pinto.
You can share a screen if you like.
Yeah, I will. Can you?
Yeah, we can see.
Yeah. So, good night, everybody. Thank you so much for allowing me to do this lecture today. Especially, this is a special thing for me because I am one of the students of. I have been house officer in surgery in NCTH. So, and this is first time I am addressing you all. So today I am going to speak about nutrition important in surgery. Why? So we will discuss about this matter. The malnutrition. Malnutrition is associated with poor surgical outcome, major surgical stress and trauma associated catabolism, and ultimately longer duration of hospital stay following surgery. So, and also we underestimate sarcopenia. When you see a patient who is not that malnourished by the appearance, the BMI is normal, but sarcopenic obesity is underestimated. So sarcopenia is associated with increased risk of post-operative complications in patients undergoing surgery for GI cancer or undergoing surgery. Probably the underlying cause may be malignancy. So we have to think about the sarcopenia as an important fact that we need to address before the patient goes into surgery. So how common is this malnutrition? Those who admitted to our tertiary healthcare settings in Sri Lanka, we have done this study in 2019 and found that prevalence of severe malnutrition, adult patients who are admitted to tertiary healthcare setting is 9.2%. The severe malnutrition, that means BMI less than 16. And also the prevalence of overweight and obesity, the prevalence is 28.1%. So 1/4 of, if you calculate, 1/4 of the patients, either they have severe undernutrition or they are overweight or obesity. So perioperative nutritional supplementation has been shown to.
I think we lost her. We will wait until she joins back.
The line is not that clear.
There must have been something with her connection. We'll see.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So
Shalika, we can't see your presentation.
am I in the hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, but we can't see your presentation.
Hello?
Shalika,
Hello?
we can hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can see you as well.
Heavy rain. There's a heavy rain, and I
Right.
don't know why the connection is not stable.
Yeah.
So
But we were able to grab more than 50% of what you said and showed. Yeah, we can go ahead, I think.
So the impact of nutrition support. So perioperative nutrition supplementation has been shown to decrease post-operative infectious complication, and it can decrease non-infectious complications, and also it can shorten the length of stay in patients undergoing GI cancer surgery. And then, so this concept came, and there is a protocol, enhanced recovery after surgery protocol, where this prehabilitation. This is a trimodal approach, including nutrition, physical exercise, and stress reducing psychological component prior to surgery. So patients, those who are undergoing surgery, they go rehabilitation prior to surgery. That is for conditioning metabolic risk to have an enhanced recovery following surgery. So what are the components in enhanced recovery after surgery? So there are so many components in ERAS protocol aimed at post-operative, pre-operative, post-operative, intraoperative, and post-operative. So there are nutritional components in this ERAS protocol. We will talk about the assessment of nutritional assessment prior to major surgery is a must in ERAS protocol. So to identify, so we have talked about the impact of nutritional support prior to surgery, and we also have talked about the gravity of malnutrition. So we need to identify patients, those who need nutrition support therapy prior to surgery. So what are the indications for nutrition support prior to surgery? So European Society of Parenteral Nutrition has recently defined diagnostic criteria surgery according to two options. So option one, if the patient's BMI, this is body mass index, less than 18.5, or either option, if the weight loss is more than 10%, or if the weight loss is more than 5% over 3 months, and also the patient is having reduced BMI. So reduced BMI means in an adult, normal adult age person, if the BMI is less than 22 BMI, and if the patient is older than 70 years, the BMI less than 20 is regarded as reduced BMI. So if this reduced BMI stay and also there's weight loss, then we can identify malnutrition. So those who have malnutrition need undergoing surgery. So we do nutrition assessment. We use screening for malnutrition using nutritional risk screening. That is what we call NRS 2002. So I will show you what NRS 2002 is. So using these screening tools, we have to do observation and documentation of oral intake, and also regular follow-up of weight and BMI, and also at the first visit onwards, we need to do nutritional counseling as well. So this is NRS 2002. It has four questions initially. Is the BMI of the patient is less than 20.5? If you tick yes, or has the patient lost weight within the last intake in the last week? That is last week, if the patient has reduced surgery intake. Is the patient severely ill? So if you find either any of these questions answer as yes, you have to do the intense nutritional risk screening. So that is final screening, where you have two components: impaired nutritional status, that is we give scores like if the weight loss is more than 5% in 3 months, or food intake is below 50 to 75% of normal requirement. So the patient will get score of 1. So likewise, if the weight loss is more than 5% within 2 months, earlier it was 3 months, now it is 2 months, or BMI is 18.5 to 20.5 plus impaired general condition, or food intake 20 to 60% of normal requirement in preceding week. So the patient would gets a score of 2. So the score of 3 is the maximum score. The patient has weight loss more than 5% in 1 month time. So that is severe malnutrition. So 50% weight loss in 3 months, or BMI less than 18.5 plus impaired general condition. So if the food intake is 0 to 25%, so the patient gets severity of the disease. So in severity of the disease, suppose 0 is normal nutritional requirement. So the disease of the patient, underlying disease, there is no high nutritional requirements. So mild score 1 is hip fracture, chronic patients in particular with acute complication, cirrhosis, COPD, those patients, they get mild 1 score. So major abdominal surgery, you see major abdominal surgery, stroke, or Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Shalika.
Okay. So when you calculate the score, if the patient gets score more than 3 or equal to 3, this patient is regarded as nutritionally at risk. So if the patient's age is more than 70 years old, we are adding one more score and so the nutritional risk become more. So this is the risk screening, and before the surgery, we are doing some investigations like, the preoperative serum albumin is a prognostic factor for complications of surgery. So if your patient has low albumin levels prior to surgery, the complication risks are more, especially the anastomotic leak risk is more. So there should be a time period for the nutritional care to implement so that the patient's albumin level nutritionally will for the albumin level to come up with the nutrition support. So preoperative anemia also need to be corrected according to the underlying cause. If you have low HB, so postoperative complications will be more and the wound healing will be less. And so if it is iron deficiency, the underlying cause should be treated before the surgery. And any vitamin mineral deficiency need to be addressed before the surgery. So nutrition therapy is the provision of nutrition So the provision of nutrient, either orally fortified food, oral nutrition supplements, or via enteral nutrition or parenteral. In case of severe metabolic risk, we need 10 to 14 days of nutrition therapy and to have a meaningful changes in functional capacity, we need 4 to 5 weeks of rehabilitation prior to surgery.
Shalika.
So after the surgery, before the surgery, is preoperative fasting necessary? So preoperative fasting from midnight, yeah. Can you see? Yeah. Hello?
Yes, you can see.
Hello, Dr. Pinto?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you. Go ahead.
So preoperative fasting from midnight is unnecessary. So patients undergoing surgery who are considered to have no specific risk of aspiration shall drink a clear fluid until 2 hours before anesthesia. 2 hours before means the time taken for a gastric emptying for clear liquids is roughly about 2 hours. In usually the patients with severe gastroparesis or diabetic patients who have those who have gastroparesis. So roughly about patients need 2 hours for gastric emptying for clear liquids. So solid shall be allowed until 6 hours before anesthesia. So this is the grade recommendation A. So what about the carbohydrate loading? So to reduce perioperative discomfort, including anxiety, oral preoperative carbohydrate treatment, what we call carbohydrate loading, instead of overnight fasting, the night before and 2 hours before surgery should be administered. So to impact post-operative insulin resistance, you know, after the surgery, the trauma-related systemic inflammatory response and the insulin resistance. So the metabolic conditioning prior to surgery, one component is this carbohydrate loading. So we aim to reduce the insulin resistance after the surgery and the hospital length of stay. So preoperative carbohydrates can be considered in patients undergoing major surgery. So what we do is we give 100 grams of maltodextrin as clear liquids. So 800 ml night before surgery and also 50 gram in 400 ml 2 hours before surgery. Theater around 8 a.m. Around 6 until 6 a.m. patient can have a clear liquid with this 50 gram of carbohydrate. So commercially available preload is there. So post-operative early feeding is one component. So after the surgery, long time duration. So oral intake, yes.
Shalika, can you, hello Shalika?
Yes.
Can you repeat the
what
previous?
Do you want me to do?
Yeah, the last part of the previous slide we didn't hear.
Carbohydrate loading.
Next one, please. Yeah, the
preoperative fasting.
Yeah. Some of this we didn't hear properly. Can you repeat, please?
Okay. So preoperative fasting. Earlier practice was the patient was kept for fasting from 10 p.m. or fasting from midnight. That is unnecessary. So nowadays, the best practice is the patients undergoing surgery clear liquids until 2 hours before the surgery, before the anesthesia. So solid diet you can allow until 6 hours before anesthesia. And also the importance of carbohydrate loading, as I say, we are giving 100 grams of carbohydrate as a clear liquid. The content is in the carbohydrate loading is maltodextrin. These are specially made to have continuous slow absorption of carbohydrate to allow the patient to have good glycemic control after the surgery. So 100 gram of maltodextrin, gram of carbohydrate in 400 ml 2 hours before surgery. So commercially available maltodextrin is called preload. And when preload is not available, we are making a conventional carbohydrate loading as well. So post-operative early feeding is practiced nowadays because we are aiming early recovery after the surgery. So oral intake. So patients feel much better if you allow them, including clear liquids, shall be initiated within hours after surgery. So just after patient recovers from surgery, you can allow the patient to have clear liquids unless there is any contraindications. So most patients we can do that. But is this really happening? So we did clinical audit in 2019 National Hospital, including 4 surgical units. So all patients admitted to elective surgery in post-surgical ward. Mean post-operative fasting duration for clear liquids after induction of anesthesia for all type of surgeries was roughly about 14 hours. So which ranges 1.1 to 73.5 hours. So mean post-operative duration fasting for either solids or semi-solid was even that was like 27.3 hours after the surgery. So these patients are still on fasting. Why? So we just wanted to see what are the reasons behind that, and these are the patients who come up with the reasons behind why they are not adhering to the instruction. So the main reason for non-adherence was instruction were not clear. So 7 patients out of 7, those who are not adhered to instruction said that the instruction was not clear. And also some patients come up with this problem because contradictory instructions by different health workers. Because the surgical team, after the surgery, they tell the patient at the theater also, so when you go to the ward, you can have, you can start having food. But at the ward, when the patient comes to the ward, nurses are afraid to start feeding if the patient might have vomiting, or then so the probably the nurses, student nurses, or the other healthcare workers, they say not to eat. So these are the contradictory instructions that cause problems. So the sleepiness for them to not adhere to the instruction. So when you start nutrition after the surgery, what is the best route? In general, oral nutritional intake shall be continued after the surgery without interruption. So best route is, the most physiological way is when you allow patient to eat normally, normal food. And if the patient's oral intake is poor, or if the patient cannot be put on oral feeding, like if the patient is ventilated or if the patient is sedated, so you might have to consider enteral tube feeding. So early enteral nutrition within 24 hours shall be initiated in patients in whom early oral nutrition cannot be started, and in whom oral intake will be inadequate, like less than 50%. more than 7 days. So these are the special risk groups: patients undergoing major head and neck or gastrointestinal surgery for cancer, patients with severe trauma, including brain injury, patients with obvious malnutrition at the time of surgery. So you cannot wait for the patient to take time. Nutrition. So the enteral route should always be the preferred route, but except these are the contraindications. Like if the patient is having intestinal obstruction or post-surgical ileus, post-surgical ileus is a common complication following surgery, especially major GI surgery. We cannot start enteral nutrition. So severe shock and intestinal ischemia and high output fistula and severe intestinal hemorrhage if the patient is not malnourished, then the patient can be on IV fluid for 5 to 7 days, so that in the meantime we could start enteral nutrition. So if the energy and nutrient requirements, if the requirements are not met, tolerance is not there. So if it is more than 7 days, the requirement is not adequate, then combination of enteral and parenteral nutrition is recommended. What we call supplementary parenteral nutrition. The recent ASPEN guideline, this is American Society of... Is there a problem?
Sorry, we missed the previous slide. Do you mind just repeating it?
Dr. Pinto, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Shalika, but as Dr. Aruna Veerasuriya said, we couldn't... yeah. Can you hear us? I think she is having some issues with the connection.
Yeah, sure.
Shalika?
Yes.
Shalika, can you just restart after you finished enteral nutrition? Yeah, this contraindication from this part onwards, it was difficult to hear.
Okay.
Right. Thanks.
So contraindication to enteral nutrition. So if these are there, we cannot start enteral nutrition. The post-surgical ileus is a common contraindication for enteral nutrition. Severe shock and intestinal ischemia. If there's intestinal ischemia, then further damage will happen if you start enteral nutrition. And high output fistula and severe intestinal hemorrhage is one of the causes for contraindications for enteral nutrition. If there's contraindication for enteral nutrition, what we are going to do is we are going to consider parenteral nutrition. So straightforward, if the patient is severely malnourished, we are not waiting for the enteral route to be developed. It will take time, so that we straight away start parenteral nutrition if the patient is severely malnourished before the surgery. So and also if the energy requirement is not met with enteral tube feeding, at least 50% within 7 days, then we can think about combination of enteral and parenteral nutrition, what we call supplementary parenteral nutrition, to meet the energy and protein gap. And also, recent ASPEN guideline, this is American Society of Parenteral Enteral Nutrition Society guideline, recommend post-operative PN for patients who cannot meet their energy needs only enterally within . So when we are thinking about administer parenteral nutrition is 3-in-1, what we call all-in-one, 3-chamber bag. So when are we considering pre-operative parenteral nutrition? So pre-operative, beforehand, before the patient going for the surgery, we can consider parenteral nutrition if the patient is severely malnourished. So severely at risk, severe nutritional risk, where energy requirement cannot be adequately met by enteral nutrition. So a period of 7 to 14 days of pre-operative parenteral nutrition, if the patient is not taking adequately, we can consider prior to surgery. So continuous monitoring and assessment of nutrition support therapy is a must once you start nutrition care. The process of early recovery from surgery need multidisciplinary approach involving healthcare team consisting of for the benefit of the patient and the family members. So these are my references, and I'm very sorry for the so many disturbances. Thank you.
Right. Students, do you have any questions for Dr. Shalika? Shalika, can you hear me?
Yes, I can
Just
hear you.
now I think we have few
Is it
patients
Dr.
who
Pinto?
are, yeah, it's Dr. Pinto. Just a passing question. We are coming across a number of obese patients, and we are doing some bariatric surgeries as well. So when a obese patient comes to say, let's say, a general practitioner, what are the things he or she should look in the first go? I mean, initial history and examination and investigations. What are the things they should look for?
In nutritional point of view,
Yes.
Yeah, roughly they have to know the height, weight of the patient and the BMI. So if the BMI of the patient is indicative of malnutrition, the WHO cutoffs are there. If the patient's BMI is less than 18.5 and the patient is awaiting a major surgery, then the clinician can refer the patient to nutrition support team. And also, if the patient's BMI is normal, but still, if the patient is having a condition like condition like esophageal cancer or something that the clinician know that the intake is less, so for not delaying, they can refer the patient to nutritional support, because we can make the diet suitable enough for the patient to eat normally, or with texture modified diets, we can support nutrition care for the patient. And if the BMI is normal, and also if you ask from the patient that whether he had lost weight, so 10% weight loss within 6 months is a significant weight loss. So this weight loss should be unintentional. So if there's unintentional weight loss, so there should be a nutritional support therapy prior to surgery. And also if the patient's parameters, like if the patient is anemic, if the patient is having low albumin levels, not because of the sepsis, like if you just see the investigation, if the patient's CRP is not that high, but the albumin level is low, but underlying other conditions are not there supportive of a low albumin levels. If the patient is having liver failure or something, then the patient's albumin production may be low. But if the patient is malnourished and the albumin level is low, then nutritional support therapy, at least for 1 month duration, will allow the patient to develop the albumin level. So the post-surgical complication will be less if the patient beforehand nutritionally sound before the patient goes for surgery. And other conditions like
right.
If the patient,
this is Dr. Arunavir Surya. I'm one of the department member here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear.
Yeah. So I come across some situations where we had to do some emergency surgeries. Situations like intestinal obstruction or maybe cancer, which bowel obstruction kind of things, but they are malnourished as well. So strangely, when you find the albumin is pretty low, and we had to do the operation as well. And at the end, you're talking about the low albumin is there, so it causes stomach leakage and all. So do you recommend that if we give albumin as parenteral therapy after operations is a good move, or do you have to give parenteral therapy once all?
I mean, it is not nutritionally giving albumin will not benefit for the patient. But if the patient's if the patient is hypovolemic, or if you want to give it as a colloid, then it will be okay. I don't know, but post-operative albumin will provide a lot of sodium in it. So the chance for the patient to go hypernatremic after surgery will be, chances are higher. So, and the albumin, if the provision of protein, what you need, parenteral protein provision is better than giving albumin. So, because we can provide all the essential amino acids for the patient with parenteral nutrition rather than giving albumin.
So you mean to say that even after the first postoperative day, we'll start giving parenteral therapy if the patient is malnourished?
Yes, if the patient is malnourished, but a post-surgical parenteral nutrition, we are waiting until at least 48 hours because the patient should be metabolically sound before starting parenteral nutrition. So if the patient is not hemodynamically, hemodynamically not stable after surgery, we are not starting parenteral nutrition very early. So first 24 to 48 hours, we are waiting not to start parenteral nutrition.
Okay. You talk about the sarcopenia and the sarcomenic obesity. For the benefit of the students, I think this is one of the new terminologies come across to the students. So do you mind explaining a little bit about the sarcomenic obesity?
Oh, yes. When the patients are obese, so the fat mass will be higher in them. So the obesity, if you take BMI is only a surrogate marker for obesity. So patients can have BMI of 25, even in Asian cutoff marks, BMI to weight. But in Asian category, our patients, those who are having obesity, less fat-free mass. So sarcopenia is when you have muscle loss with reduced functional capacity. Skeletal, progressive generalized skeletal muscle decline associated with loss of muscle mass and function, that is associated with increased adverse outcomes. So these adverse outcomes including falls, frailty, and functional decline. So when the patient is having sarcopenia, so their muscle mass is less. So muscle mass is less means their respiratory muscle is also less. So if the patient undergoes surgery and if the patient is put on to a ventilator, so weaning off from a ventilator will be, the patient will take more time to wean off from the ventilator. So that's why we need to identify sarcopenic patients beforehand, so that in the prehabilitation, within 1 month, it is not possible if the patient is undergoing an emergency surgery, but if the patient is going for elective surgery, if you find the sarcopenia, then we can incorporate nutritional care as well as exercise, so that when you give high protein diet and combined with exercise, the patient's muscle mass can be enhanced, so that their recovery will be faster. So obesity, the sarcopenia, the muscle mass loss, we need to identify beforehand. So if you look at the patient and if the patient might not appear as malnourished, but the patient's BMI is normal, but the muscle mass is less. So we can, in the nutrition clinic, we can do the fat-free mass analysis using the body impedance assay. It is a special assessment we can do to assess the amount of fat mass and the fat-free mass of the patient. So with the nutrition therapy, continuous assessment, we can assess whether the patient is developing muscle mass. So it is very important in sarcopenic obese patient.
Thank you, Sharika. That's very well explained. Just I have a couple of more questions, if you don't mind. One is that, so you talked about the carbohydrate preload before surgery. And so do you recommend that it to be given to patients even diabetes?
Actually,
and the second question is, I have one more question. Now, you talk about the shortening the fasting period up to 6 hours. That's very well explained, and I understand that's to be done. But there are some practical scenarios like, now, if you keep the patient fasting for 10 p.m. and if you want to feed the patient again, so if you are planning the operation at 8 a.m. in the morning, I would rather like the patient to sleep nicely. I prefer to give him some sedatives and keep him nice and slept to reduce anxiety. And if you have to feed him again, if you have to wake him up at 4 a.m. and perhaps 6 a.m. or so, you have to give some tea or whatever. So do you recommend that we have to wake him up and give some feeds at 4 a.m. Or rather we let him sleep?
Yeah, that is one of the problems with our patients, because some of the patients, they don't like to wake up and eat early in the morning. So elderly patients, they will not eat early in the morning. So the surgery time duration is, the surgery start around 8 a.m. So the patient has to 6 hours before they have to take the carbohydrate loading. So there's if that is a problem for the patient, there's an alternative method of providing intravenous glucose, 200 grams of glucose with IV fluid. So those who do not want to wake up can have IV dextrose overnight, so that their sleep will not be disturbed. So, but the guideline recommends those who cannot take enteral carbohydrate loading only to use the IV route. And if the surgery is happening in the daytime, like in the evening, so that we can practice this without an issue. And also, practically, all the patients who are going for surgery in the morning will not go inside the theater at sharp 8 a.m. So those who are taken inside like 11 a.m. or 10 a.m., they can have the sleep as well as the carbohydrate loading.
And the question is about the carbohydrate preload to be given to even to diabetic patients. So is it safe?
Actually, in National Hospital, the current situation is some of the anesthetists do not like preload for diabetic patients. So the guideline recommends even for the diabetic patients, if they have before surgery, if their glycemic control is good, they can be given carbohydrate loading. But in Sri Lankan situation, some anesthetics, they find it very difficult if the patient's blood sugar control is not good after carbohydrate loading. So we always consider anesthetic, because the patients are coming from anesthetic clinic for the nutritional assessment. So we, with their guidance only, recommend giving carbohydrate loading for diabetic patients, especially diabetic patients, those who are having gastroparesis. We need to be very careful of giving carbohydrate loading. So currently we don't have the preload, so we are using conventional method also. So we don't have a proper glycemic control with this adding glucose into clear liquid and giving. So maltodextrin is the best method because the blood glucose absorption following carbohydrate loading is very slowly happening very slowly. So that is one question, one problem for us giving glucose or sugar diluted in clear liquids. So the fast glycemic response will create a problem. So we are very cautious giving carbohydrate loading for diabetic patients in Sri Lanka.
Any other questions from the students?
Excuse me, madam. Can I have a question?
Okay, then, yeah, are there any questions? Right, so,
Yes, sir.
yes, go ahead.
Yes, sir. About the same topic. So, madam, can you please give us clear instructions about now these days we are instructing patients to get down king coconut water 1 liter and put 50 grams of glucose into that like that. So can you give clear instruction about this practical issue? As we don't have that prepared one, how to do that?
Yeah.
And also the second following question, as you said, we have some patients, we keep them by mouth for 2 or 3 days. As now we are having we had a patient on ward 41 with intussusception, and we kept her for 2-3 days need by mouth, and so we cannot give oral. So how to do the parenteral carbohydrate loading before the surgery for such patient?
So if the patient is pre-operatively 3-4 days fasting, you might need to consider starting parenteral nutrition. So if the patient is nutritionally vulnerable, we might need to consider starting pre-operative parenteral nutrition for that patient. So anyway, if you start parenteral nutrition, you are providing glucose with the parenteral nutrition. If you want to do the carbohydrate loading, not enterally but parenteral route, so 200 grams of dextrose should be given via the intravenous route. So 10% dextrose, you can start with 10% dextrose prior to surgery. So previous night, so the amount you need to give is 200 grams. And the other question, so if you are using king coconut water, so 100 ml of king coconut has usually 5 ml of sugar already in it. So you don't need to add 50 grams of glucose into that. So considering the amount you are giving, the 800 ml of king coconut water, you have 8 teaspoons of sugar inside the king coconut itself. So you have to think the rest of the amount need to be added to the king coconut with glucose. So we have already created a leaflet for how to make this preload using conventional food items like in National Hospital, they are using plain tea with added sugar, and we are using king coconut with added dextrose, and in some other places also they are using king coconut, and in guideline it says sometimes lemonade and clear fruit juices can be used as carbohydrate loading. So we have already prepared a leaflet. So anybody who is interested can come to the nutrition clinic and get the proper guidance how to make the carbohydrate loading with separate food items. Is that clarified your question?
Yes, madam. Thank you very much. And madam, that a patient keeping nil by mouth, if it's not malnutrition vulnerable and young patients, we can keep him nil by mouth with IV fluid for 5 to 7 days, as you mentioned earlier. Ne?
Yes, 5 to 7 days, but you have to give the potassium and the other requirements. Okay.
Yes. With IV fluids, replacement of potassium and sodium.
Yeah, but the requirement of daily requirement you should give. So usually our patients roughly around 50 to 60 kilos or 70 kilos, 1 millimole per kg of sodium need is there, and potassium also like that. So you have to provide electrolyte, and you need to replace the electrolyte imbalances.
Right. Any other questions, students?
And also the madam, we do the CBS, PDS, and if it come down, we give dextrose like that. And
so especially when you are giving dextrose, you have to consider if the patients are if the patients are a male patient with alcoholic history, you need to provide thiamine as well.
right.
Okay, Shalika, I think we can wrap it up. I thank you very much on behalf of all the students and our department for taking part in a lecture series, and I hope that we can have some more dedicated lectures on some dedicated topics later on. I think Subudhu Kumarage sir has already checked in. Sir, we are finishing at the moment. Subudhu sir?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes,
we were just
I joined at the last moment.
Yeah.
I was listening to her things, and the enthusiasm of the students are also greatly appreciated.
Yes.
And the fact that sort of they have got the idea of carbohydrate loading preoperatively. It's interesting to see that also. Anyway, Shalika, thank you very much. And hello.
Hello.
Yeah, we couldn't hear you last part. We couldn't hear you.
Thank you.
Sir, thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this program.
Okay, then we'll call it a day. Right. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Good night. Good night.
Thank you very much, Shanika, on behalf of the Department of